In the heart of a bustling multicultural city, where vibrant streets were filled with a mosaic of faces and voices, an underlying tension simmered, quietly threatening to erupt. The atmosphere was thick with a sense of unease as the community grappled with its fraught relationship with the police department, an institution that was supposed to serve and protect yet often seemed to cast a long shadow of mistrust and fear. This division was emblematic of a larger struggle, one that pitted citizens against those sworn to uphold the law. Inside the precinct, whispers of a culture of silence and a persistent air of abuse of power loomed large, creating a chasm between the officers and the very people they were meant to protect. Among the officers was Darius, a seasoned veteran with nearly 20 years of service under his belt. He stood as a bridge between duty and morality, a man marked by the trials he had weathered in his career. Darius had seen it all, having navigated the complexities of law enforcement with a mixture of pragmatism and compassion. He understood the nuances of his job. However, the recent influx of new recruits, including Ryan, a brash and idealistic young officer eager to prove himself, posed a certain threat to Darius's philosophy. Ryan displayed a reckless confidence that bordered on arrogance, a stark contrast to Darius's cautious demeanor. While Darius had learned to balance the demands of his role with the ethics that guided him, Ryan embraced a black-and-white worldview, seeing law enforcement as a badge of honor rather than a responsibility. Then there was Jasmine, a resilient woman who wore her identity with pride. A member of the very community that struggled against the police presence, Jasmine attempted to foster dialogues about justice and equity. Her activism was often met with skepticism and hostility, making her a frequent target of derogatory comments from those who sought to silence her voice. Yet, her determination shone brightly, casting her as a beacon of hope for many disillusioned by the status quo. For Jasmine, the fight for justice was personal, and she had become an outspoken advocate for change, often illustrating the chasm between the code of silence within the police department and the cries for accountability from the citizens. The tensions that had been brewing beneath the surface were brought to a boiling point one fateful afternoon. During what began as a routine call, Darius found himself in the center of a confrontation that would irreversibly change the trajectory of his career. Responding to a dispute in a local park, Darius arrived on the scene to find Ryan aggressively confronting Jasmine, who stood her ground, unyielding in the face of intimidation. Darius, witnessing the humiliation that Jasmine was enduring, felt a familiar rage boiling within him. He had always believed in protecting the vulnerable, and here in front of him, he saw an innocent citizen being unjustly treated by a colleague. "Hey!" Darius barked as he stepped into the fray, instinctively positioning himself between Ryan and Jasmine. His voice echoed through the park, halting Ryan's advances. "This isn't how we handle things." Darius's emergence into the situation was a pivotal moment, one that rattled the very foundations of his precinct. Ryan, taken aback, turned his brusque demeanor towards Darius, eyes blazing with indignation. "You're siding with her?" He spat, incredulous, as if the very idea was an affront to his authority and duty. "Yes, I am," Darius asserted, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "You're crossing a line. We don't get to treat people like this." As the words left Darius's mouth, the tension thickened. Jasmine looked at Darius with a mixture of surprise and gratitude, her expression indicating a fleeting sense of hope amidst the chaos. It was in that moment that Darius forged a crucial decision. He had to stand up for what was right, not simply as a cop but as a man with principles. He could no longer remain complicit in a culture that normalized abuse and discrimination. With a swift motion, Darius called in the incident, initiating the procedure to detain Ryan for his aggressive behavior. He could feel the stares of disbelief and anger from his fellow officers, each one a testament to the unyielding loyalty that existed in the face of injustice. As he placed Ryan in handcuffs, the weight of his actions settled heavily on Darius's shoulders. What lay ahead was an uncertain path, fraught with potential repercussions for his career and relationships within the department. Yet, Darius remained resolute, convinced that integrity must take precedence over allegiance to a flawed system. The clash between Darius and Ryan would serve as the spark igniting an already volatile situation, pushing the precinct to a crisis point. It was a move not without consequence, as whispers of betrayal and inconsolable loyalty rumbled through the ranks. Darius braced himself for the fallout, uncertain of what awaited him within the precinct walls, a fortress that now felt more like a battlefield. In the days that followed the explosive confrontation in the park, Darius found himself navigating a labyrinth of emotions and reactions within the precinct. The air hung heavy with tension, the aftermath of his decision weighing on him like a dark cloud. As word of Ryan's arrest spread through the department, It became clear that Darius had not only ignited a storm but had unwittingly placed himself at the center of an ideological battleground, one defined by drastically different perspectives on law enforcement, loyalty, and ultimately, justice. Tension crackled in the locker room, where officers exchanged furtive glances and whispered between themselves. Conversations that had once flowed with ease were now laced with uncertainty and resentment. Darius could feel the divide growing thicker around him. He moved through it like a ghost, once a respected member of the force but now marred by the label of traitor. The clang of lockers and the low murmur of discontent only served to amplify his isolation. What had begun as a singular act of courage to defend an innocent woman had spiraled into a crisis of conscience that challenged the very fabric of the department. Driven by his conviction, Darius had prepared himself for confrontations, but nothing could have prepared him for the tempest that awaited him. The moment the doors of the precinct swung open that morning, he felt the palpable chill in the air. The weight of every eye upon him was suffocating. It felt as though he was walking through a battlefield, each unspoken word a bullet aimed straight at his resolve. Ryan, with his youthful bravado, had gathered a small cadre of supporters, those who stood behind the old norms of loyalty and silence. They rallied around him, seeing Darius's actions as a direct affront to the brotherhood that was supposed to bind them together. As he approached his desk, Darius was confronted by Officer Ramirez, a longtime friend who had always been an unwavering ally. The conflict was written across Ramirez's face. "What the hell were you thinking, Darius?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. "You've turned this place upside down." "I was thinking about doing what's right," Darius replied, meeting Ramirez's gaze with determination. "I couldn't just stand by and watch someone abuse their power. You know that." "Right or wrong, this is the precinct's code," Ramirez shot back, his voice rising with tension. "You're jeopardizing us all. You can't just make a spectacle of a fellow officer. You could have handled it differently." Darius felt the weight of his friend's words. The harsh reality of their profession began to gnaw at him, questioning the ethics that had once felt so solid under his feet. Was it indeed a spectacle to stand up for justice, or merely an act of rebellion? The lines of right and wrong began to blur, leading to sleepless nights filled with turbulent thoughts. Had he undermined a culture that demanded unquestioning loyalty to the badge, even when it contradicted the principles he held dear? As whispers circulated among the officers, it became clear that there was no middle ground. The precinct split further into factions. Some stood in solidarity with Ryan, championing the mantra of loyalty above all else, while others began to approach Darius cautiously, acknowledging the need for change, though fear held them back. The intensity of the debates echoed through the halls like an unyielding storm, with some officers chastising others for their cowardice in the face of corruption. The emerging divisions painted a grim tableau of a department at war with its own identity. Darius felt the burden of leadership weigh heavily upon him. Choices had to be made, but which road to pursue was unclear. He sought solace in the quiet confines of his thoughts, contemplating his loyalties to both his colleagues and the community they served. The grievances aired against him rang in his ears, challenging the very essence of his being. The sacrifices made for honesty began to feel monumental, demanding everything he had once cherished: camaraderie, respect, and his identity as a law officer. Jasmine often came to his mind, a constant reminder of why he had acted so boldly. Her face, filled with a mix of gratitude and surprise during the confrontation with Ryan, served as both an anchor and an indictment. She had taken a risk to speak out, often risking her safety for the sake of countless others. Darius couldn't help but wonder if he could truly stand beside her fight when his own integrity began to falter. Perhaps in his bid to help, he had unwittingly placed not just himself under attack, but also Jasmine, casting her into a spotlight that might make her vulnerable to further hostility from those who wished to silence her. One evening, while sifting through reports in the dim light of his office, Darius looked at the cases that crossed his desk daily, each one representing a life, a story, a struggle. He realized that staying in the department, within a failing system that fostered silence and complicity, was its own kind of betrayal. Perhaps taking action, though fraught with peril, was the only way to begin to mend the fractures in the community he cared so deeply for. It was time to weigh the cost of his choices, to confront the tumult enveloping him, and to decide whether he would continue to fight for change or succumb to the very pressures he had resisted for so long. With the dawn of a new day, Darius resolved to honor what Jasmine stood for, to face the tumult head-on. He would not let fear dictate his path any longer. Instead, he would seek allies, opening dialogues with others who yearned for reform. It was a risk, but he understood that true loyalty was not an unwavering fealty to the organization but rather a commitment to justice. both for the badge he wore and for the people he had sworn to protect. This was his moment to choose a side, the side of truth and integrity, in a battle that demanded nothing less than his unwavering spirit and resolve. As dawn broke over the city, the air was thick with tension in the precinct where Darius patrolled. The events of the past few days hung heavily in the air, each moment of silence echoing the unvoiced struggles of his colleagues. Each time he crossed paths with Ryan or anyone supporting the young officer, he felt the angst rolling off them like smoke from a fire, thick, persistent, and suffocating. Darius's convictions were strong, but so were the consequences of challenging the status quo. He spent countless hours together with his thoughts, mulling over the raw friction between duty and camaraderie. The more he reflected on Ryan's behavior towards Jasmine during that fateful incident, the clearer the choice became for Darius. It was not just about standing from the sidelines anymore. He could no longer live with the knowledge of abuse being tolerated within the ranks. The very ethics he had striven to uphold were now in stark contrast with a hollow sense of loyalty that seemed to bind the officers together like shackles. He envisioned a department where officers like Jasmine could walk the streets unafraid of police brutality, where every badge was a symbol of service and protection, not fear and intimidation. That morning, after a restless night filled with sleepless contemplation and a knot of dread that churned in his stomach, Darius arrived at the precinct with renewed determination. He was fully aware that his decision to confront Ryan would reverberate not just through the precinct but throughout the entire police force. If he were to make a statement, it had to be definitive. He resolved to take a stand, a chance that could reshape the landscape of their department forever. The moment he spotted Ryan leaning back against the wall with his typical defiant posture, Darius's heart raced. Just beyond Ryan, Darius could see clusters of officers whispering among themselves, eyes darting toward him with a mix of curiosity and caution. The tension felt electric, sparking in the air like static before a storm. He squared his shoulders, forcing himself to take a breath that seemed impossible, and moved toward Ryan with purpose. "Ryan," Darius called, his voice resonating clearly over the murmurs. Ryan turned, surprise flashing across his features, swiftly morphing into a guarded concern. Darius took another breath, grounding himself. "We need to talk. Alone." Ryan scoffed, crossing his arms defiantly. "What's there to talk about? You've already found yourself the department's favorite little hero, haven't you?" There was more venom than humor in his voice, and it hung heavy in Darius's ears. "Let's take this outside," Darius insisted, his own voice betraying none of the rumbling apprehension in his chest. The words felt like a thunderclap, disrupting the hushed conversations around them. With a flicker of hesitation, Ryan pushed off the wall and followed, both of them eclipsed by the gazes of the collective. Once outside, Darius felt the world close in around him, the looming shadows of the building amplifying the weight of what he was about to do. "You know what you did to Jasmine was wrong," he began, heart throbbing in his chest. "Your behavior wasn't just unprofessional, it was abusive." The gravity of his words hung between them, a tangible force that rendered them both momentarily silent. "Look, Darius," Ryan spat, his eyes narrowing with indignation. "You don't understand what it's like out there. We have to maintain control, and sometimes what?" Darius interrupted, anger igniting in his veins. "Sometimes you have to bully and intimidate?" He took a step closer, the intensity palpable. "I'm done watching you play the role of the tough guy at the expense of others. You're not above the law, no one is." Ryan bristled, anger radiating from him like heat from a flame. "You're making a big mistake, Darius. You think you're a knight in shining armor, but you're just seeming pathetic, throwing away everything for some misplaced sense of justice." That was it. Darius felt a surge of resolve wash over him. "No, Ryan, you're the one making a mistake. For far too long, we've turned a blind eye to what's unacceptable. You've pushed too far." In that moment, Darius made the choice that would alter the course of his life. "I'm placing you under arrest for excessive force and workplace misconduct." Ryan's face contorted with disbelief as the words sank in. "You wouldn't dare," he snarled, but there was a tremor in his voice, a sign of doubt creeping in. "Watch me," Darius said, the steel in his tone unwavering. He reached for his handcuffs, fighting against the unity of betrayal and disappointment blooming in Ryan's eyes. Every officer watching knew what was happening. They were caught between the familiar loyalties they had cultivated and the shocking reality unfolding before them. Once Ryan had been subdued and taken into custody, the precinct erupted in chaos. The murmurs became shouts, lines were drawn, and the camaraderie that once felt so solid splintered before Darius's eyes. Colleagues he had once considered friends now looked upon him with disdain, casting sneering glances that stung worse than any physical insult. "Traitor," echoed through the air, and Darius felt the sting of isolation begin to claw at him. The fallout from his actions reverberated long after the excitement of the arrest. In the days following, Darius was left to navigate the fiery backlash from his co-workers. Officers he had once shared laughs and camaraderie with now turned their backs, engaged in furtive conversations that he sensed held his name within them. The nigh imperceptible distance grew wider, each interaction descending into awkward silences or explosive arguments. Facing this growing ostracism, Darius struggled to defend his choices. It was never about disloyalty to the badge, rather it was a commitment to the community they were sworn to protect, an understanding that true honor lay not in unquestioned loyalty but in unwavering integrity. He tried to convey this to his colleagues, but many had already made up their minds, their ideological walls firmly erected around them. "Darius, you've thrown everything away," Officer Ramirez shouted one day, frustration spilling over during roll call. "What were you thinking? You've ruined your career for this." Anguish and anger tangled within him, but Darius stood his ground. "I won't apologize for standing up against abuse. We're supposed to uphold the law. That includes holding each other accountable. If this is how you feel, maybe you don't belong here." Ramirez shot back, his words cutting deeper than any blade. The isolation grew, becoming an insidious beast that invaded Darius's mind each night. The faces of stunned colleagues, voices echoing taunts of betrayal, filled his dreams. But within that turmoil emerged a certainty: he had made the right choice. He had opened the door to a dialogue that was long overdue, and while navigating the hostility was crippling, he understood the necessity of the path he had taken. Throughout it all, the image of Jasmine remained a beacon. He represented hope for a more just and equitable department, a future where fear would not dictate how they conducted themselves. Darius clung to that hope, determined to carry the torch of accountability, no matter how high the flames of dissent rose around him. He would confront the criticism and the anger, ready to fight for a future that the precinct desperately needed, even if it meant standing alone. The tension in the precinct had reached a boiling point. Darius could feel it in the air as he walked the corridors lined with officers who had once been his brothers and sisters in arms. Now they turned their backs on him, whispering and casting wary glances that felt like daggers. A palpable hostility brewed around him like a storm about to burst. His decision to arrest Ryan had caused a schism within the department, dividing the officers into fierce factions. As each day passed, Darius faced increasing hostility. It began with snide remarks and passive-aggressive comments, but soon escalated to outright threats. One evening, after a particularly grueling shift, Darius found a note on his desk that read, "Watch your back, traitor." The message sent a cold shiver down his spine. He knew better than to dismiss it. The very essence of his career felt at risk. He had stepped out of line, challenging not just a colleague but the unwritten code of loyalty that defined their brotherhood. Yet for him, this was not merely about personal safety or reputation. It was about the principle of justice and accountability, ideals that he had vowed to uphold with every breath. Each day, he felt the weight of condemnation growing heavier on his shoulders, pushing him further into isolation. He found comfort only in the thought that he was standing up for something greater, but even that was being overshadowed by doubt and the gnawing realization that he had inadvertently put a target on his own back. Instead of camaraderie, there was a growing sense of dread that combined with the loneliness he could not escape. Darius felt as though he was caught in a whirlwind, where every gust threatened to sweep away the values he fought to defend. The atmosphere within the precinct was charged, a discomfort radiating from every officer who had to choose sides. The ongoing feud transformed into a dangerous game, one where the unwritten rules dictated alliances and treachery. Friends became foes, laughter faded into silence, and every interaction became a minefield he had to navigate carefully. As the situation deteriorated, the real fear settled in. Could he protect himself, let alone change the culture that had allowed such behavior to flourish unchallenged? Just when the tension seemed impossible to bear, Chief Montgomery decided he could no longer stand idly by. Recognizing that the unity of the team had all but collapsed, he summoned everyone to the briefing room, a place where decisions were made and order was restored. As the officers moved into the room, an eerie quiet fell over them, the air thick with anxiety and anticipation. Chief Montgomery stood at the front, his expression stern but focused, embodying the authority that the department so desperately needed in that moment. "Listen up, everyone," he began, his voice steady and authoritative. "We are on the brink of something damaging. The actions of one officer shouldn't divide us as a team or fracture the commitment we all made to serve this community. It's been made clear that there are rifts forming between us, and I cannot allow this to continue. His gaze swept across the congregation, capturing the attention of everyone present. Darius sat silently amidst the sea of faces, his heart pounding as he awaited the chief's words. Montgomery continued, "I know the events of the past few weeks have brought a lot of emotions to the surface, and I commend those of you who have stood by your convictions. However, we are here to serve and protect, not to undermine each other. We are all on the same side, let's not forget that." Montgomery paused, allowing the weight of his statement to settle in, before addressing the crux of the matter. Effective immediately, I'm proposing training for all of you, training focused on bias and ethics in policing. The world is changing, and we must change with it. We can't afford to have officers who react based on fear or resentment. We need to foster empathy and understanding within our ranks. Darius could hardly believe what he was hearing. The idea that they might finally address these deeply embedded issues resonated within him, stirring a flicker of hope. Perhaps this was the beginning of a transformation that could reverse the poisonous tide threatening the department. But he was also skeptical, wonder if these sessions would be a mere band-aid on a deep festering wound rather than an authentic commitment to change. I urge each of you to approach this with an open mind, Montgomery continued, to examine your own perspectives and practices. Everyone has a role to play in this department. It's essential to recognize how our actions can directly affect those around us, whether it's a colleague or a member of the community. The time has come for us to confront uncomfortable truths and work towards a better future. As Montgomery's voice echoed in the briefing room, Darius could see the expressions of his fellow officers shifting. Some wore skeptical looks while others appeared contemplative, considering what the chief was urging. It was a tumultuous moment for the department, but perhaps, just perhaps, it was the catalyst they needed to bridge the chasm created by the chaos of recent events. We cannot condone behavior that undermines our mission, Montgomery concluded, his voice resonating with authority. I am asking you all to join this journey toward improvement. Together, we can become stronger, united in purpose, integrity, and respect. Let's take this opportunity to grow, not just as a team but as a family. Darius felt a mixture of apprehension and excitement bubble within him, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself to feel a fraction of hope. This meeting could mark the turning point they desperately needed, the chance to turn hostile divisions into credible discussions. He knew that not all would be convinced, but somewhere deep down, he could sense that a flicker of change was igniting, and with it, the potential for a brighter future for the precinct and its community. Following Montgomery's address, the buzz of conversations filled the room, officers murmuring amongst themselves as they processed his words. Darius felt an unusual camaraderie beginning to form as the officers engaged in dialogue, their defenses momentarily lowered. It was a promising start, but they still had a long road ahead. The real challenge would come from bearing the weight of this newfound awareness, as each officer faced their own biases while working to repair the fractures that had emerged within their ranks. Darius would stand at the forefront of that journey, committed to pushing through the discomfort that lay ahead, always bearing in mind the principle he sought to uphold. The road to recovery would not be easy, nor would it be without conflict, but with every step he took, he aimed to build a future where accountability was etched into the very fabric of their duties. Through empathy and understanding, perhaps they could bind the wounds of the past and emerge stronger together, united in their goal of protecting and serving the very community they had sworn to uphold. The journey toward reconciliation had begun, albeit slowly, within the precinct. As the days turned into weeks, the atmosphere started to shift, permeated by an air of cautious optimism. The training sessions, which once felt like an imposition, now transformed into vital forums for dialogue and reflection. Darius stood at the helm of these discussions, buoyed by Chief Montgomery's unwavering support. The pair worked tirelessly to create spaces where officers could express their views openly, discussing ethics and responsibility without fear of repercussion. The first training session was a storm of emotions, each officer wrestling with their perceptions and the biases they had long taken for granted. Darius facilitated conversations, encouraging his colleagues to share their experiences and to challenge the culture of silence that had enveloped them for too long. He remembered the icy silence following his arrest of Ryan and how it had felt like standing alone on an island surrounded by choppy waters. Now, he sought to ensure no one else would ever feel that same isolation again. Let's start with the basics, Darius said, addressing the small huddle of officers in the training room. What does accountability really mean to us as law enforcement professionals? Silence blanketed the room as they pondered, the only sound being the soft click of a pen against paper. Slowly, hands rose, voices hesitantly emerging to share thoughts that had been locked away, drowned out by the louder, more aggressive narrative of camaraderie built on implicit loyalty. "I think it means being honest with ourselves," one officer finally spoke, a younger patrolman named Jacob, whose voice barely rose above a whisper. "It's about admitting when we make mistakes and learning from them." Darius nodded, encouraged by Jacob's candidness. "Exactly. Mistakes happen, but it's our duty to own them. It's how we grow, both as individuals and as a unit." As the weeks unfolded, these discussions became a crucible for change. The officers began to shed their preconceived notions and biases, while breaking down the walls that had kept them so divided. The old mentality of us versus them, between officers and the community, and even more acutely within the precinct itself, started to fade. Through honest dialogue, empathy began to flourish, and with it, a restoration of trust. Darius saw the once tense corridors of the precinct gradually fill with shared conversations, laughter, and mutual respect. Officers who had previously returned his kindness with cold shoulders began to engage with him more openly. He could sense that they were beginning to understand his actions not as acts of betrayal, but as a leap toward a healthier, more ethical environment. Notably, veteran officers like Mark, who had once been one of Ryan's staunchest defenders, approached Darius one afternoon after a particularly engaging training session. "I didn't get it at first," Mark confessed, his voice tinged with vulnerability. "I thought you were just throwing our brotherhood under the bus. But seeing how this has made all of us rethink our actions, I realize you were on the right path." Darius felt a mix of relief and gratitude wash over him. Each acknowledgement brought collective healing, and for the first time, he felt supported in his stance. Slowly but surely, the precinct was adapting to its newfound purpose, a commitment to serving the community while upholding each other to higher ethical standards. Amid this gradual transformation, tensions still occasionally bubbled to the surface. Some officers were not willing to let go of past grievances, and there were moments of dissent. But the culture of silence that had once reigned began to erode more each day. They found themselves discussing uncomfortable truths about their work, their duty to protect, and the systemic issues that had long been swept aside. As Darius navigated these dynamics, he reflected on his own journey. He began to recognize the profound shift within himself, one that mirrored the metamorphosis of the precinct. He used to see his role as simply enforcing the law, but now he understood that the enormous weight of responsibility included fostering a community of accountability. In moments of quiet contemplation, he acknowledged that the quest against the abuse of power started with oneself, a lesson he had come to value deeply. As accountability grew within his colleagues, they started to take tangible action in their interactions with the community. Officers became more engaged in outreach programs, seeking to understand the concerns and needs of the people they served. The relationship between the precinct and the community began to flourish, gradually rebuilding trust that had been missing for too long. Darius could see the fruits of their labor, a reassurance that they stood united for a common cause. In private conversations with Chief Montgomery, Darius often shared his thoughts on how this change could evolve further. "We've taken the first steps," he would say, "but we can't stop here. This is about building a new legacy for the department, one built on transparency and respect." Montgomery nodded in agreement, enthusiasm evident in his demeanor. The chief, too, felt the growing momentum, and with it, the sense of hope. He actively encouraged more community engagement efforts within the precinct, prioritizing a culture that prioritized listening and respect moving forward. As time passed, Darius felt a lightness in the air that had once felt bogged down by tension and fear. The shift in perspective transformed their work environment into one of mutual support and learning. Officers began to embrace each other's differences as strengths rather than weaknesses, and accountability became woven into the fabric of their day-to-day operations. The narrative of the precinct now bore the potential of a brighter future, a testament to the power of responsibility, understanding, and unity in the face of adversity. Darius closed his eyes one evening as he reflected on the changes that had taken place. He could not ignore the struggles they had faced, but rather than allowing those experiences to weigh him down, he felt fortified by them. In the heart of the precinct, Darius stood among his colleagues, realizing that their combined efforts to confront uncomfortable truths had shaped the reality of their environment. As he looked around at the faces of his fellow officers, he could see how far they had come. No longer were they divided, they were allies, partners, and vital components of a force committed to ethical policing. The journey was far from over, and challenges undoubtedly lay ahead, but Darius knew they would face them together. In those moments, he understood the true essence of their work, rooted in justice, empathy, and accountability. With renewed commitment, they prepared to not only serve their community but to honor the values they had rediscovered within themselves, ever vigilant against the lure of complacency and willing to stand firm in their resolve to create a more just, respectful, and compassionate policing culture for the future.